Welcome to Season 3, the final episode 10, Chronicles of UK Salafism, an Insider Perspective. This episode will not only focus on the year 2019 and specific events that transpired, but also act as a review on the previous episodes and decades in which Salafism played various roles and contributed to various developments across the Muslim landscape in the UK and wider society also. Salafism's contributions, the good, the bad and the ugly, as well as its influence on the socio-religious and socio-cultural landscapes, were also discussed in previous episodes, and they will be touched upon briefly in this final one. In fact, very few would argue against Salafis' increasing presence and indeed prominence in shaping second and third generation Muslims, as well as a significant proportion of converts, especially insofar as it relates to seeking authenticity in resources, in religious learning, in religious orthodoxy and practice. In fact, Quinton Wojtorovic, who I've referred to previously, an academic and practitioner from the US, he observed in the mid-noughties, and I'll quote from him and other academics as well, quote, "The Salafis constitute one of the fastest growing Islamic movements and enjoy a global reach in virtually all countries," end quote. And as I previously mentioned, Quinton was the originator of that three-pronged typology that classified Salafis into quietists, politicos and jihadis, conflating the Muslim Brotherhood Ikhwani ideology and Khariji Takfiri ideology with Salafis. And while many academics and governments adopted this particular classification, others like me have countered them. And I'll refer to Dr. Annabel Inge and her book, The Making of a Salafi Muslim Woman, in which she states, quote, "Typologies certainly have their uses. They can help us understand the similarities and differences between groups and interpretations and their relationships with one another. But using the term Salafi inclusively to refer to such a wide range of interpretations and groups can have the opposite effect, especially if we are not meticulous in our qualification of the term. This is for three reasons." She then lists those as follows. First, doing so may perpetuate widespread confusion regarding the term Salafi, which nowadays seems to appear in the media whenever there is an attempted or successful terrorist attack, often without qualification. This blanket use of the term puts non-violent conservative Muslims at risk of further marginalization and maybe even criminalization. It is particularly problematic in the Western context, where most Salafis are non-violent and often quietists. Second, that the three Salafi types share the same creed is not strictly true. Quietists condemn as bid'ah, innovation, the more political group's invocation of an additional category of Tawheed called Tawheed al-Hakimiyya, unity of sovereignty, to justify more organized or violent activities. They also disagree on other essential aspects of creed, such as the conditions for belief and disbelief and how to understand some of Allah's attributes. This weakens the basis for classifying the three strands as all part of the same movement. Third, by locating the only points of difference squarely in the political domain, the three-part typology encourages the mistaken belief that purists are completely apolitical and lack a concrete program of Islamic reform. End of quote. I'll move on to the next stage of this podcast, in which I want to refer to my cognitive development framework, that fourth stage framework I referred to in episodes or seasons 1 and 2 in more detail. I referred to them in this season, but albeit to a lesser degree. And as a reminder, the 4 stages of cognitive development are the founding stage, stage 1, a very rudimentary cognitive stage. The second stage was the youthful, idealistic phase of development. And these first two stages, founding and youthful, were very abstract in their acquisition of knowledge and development. And then there was the third stage, being the adult, more developed stage, reflective stage. And the final, most rooted and comprehensive stage of cognition was the mature stage. So those four stages I continue to reference at various levels when looking at personal development myself, for example, and I highlighted during the 90s and early noughties that I was still very much at, according to my own estimation, the second youthful stage because of the level and degree of activism that was taking place, as were many individuals. I did mention at the beginning of this particular season how cult elements of Salafis remain even until now at these particular rudimentary stages, and that's by willful design and it's a strategy from cult leadership. But I will touch upon that as we move further forward. In revisiting this framework, I now want to apply them on two levels. The first one will be where various communities are positioned in 2019. The second level would be where the Salafi movement and Salafis on the whole are positioned. And consideration has never been given, I think, to the latter, hence me focusing on it in this particular episode. So starting with the first one, where various Salafi communities are positioned along the framework, while I'm loath to provide yet another delineation or categorization of Salafis, there have been enough typologies that have been proffered academically. Perhaps my insider perspectives carry more legitimacy, having been an active participant and adherent of Salafism since converting to Islam 30 years ago. So, category one, I would term as referring to localized and wider community engaged Salafis, like the predominantly convert-led Brixton Mosque in South London, from where I herald. And an academic called Kate Ziberi observed, converts may have greater empathy with non-Muslims because of their non-Muslim past and ongoing relationships with their family of origin. Researcher Ali Kos, in his 90s study of white converts in particular, stated, they, converts, still regard themselves as members of their society and they do not favour isolation. On the contrary, they are fully conscious and aware of their own local environment as well as universal aspects of the faith they have adopted. End of quote. And I'll refer to my own observations regarding Muslim identity from my research and my book, Extremists in Our Midst, Confronting Terror, sorry. And I stated as follows, quote, the apparent insularity witnessed among some of the more culturally based traditional Asian communities was missing within these particular urban contexts, whereas instead, a more embracing approach was evident among urban Salafi communities, particularly in South London. So to recap, that first categorization that I've given was the localized, community-engaged Salafis like Brixton. The second category that I've observed over the past 30 years is an insular, localized, culturally engaged Salafis who return to being more closely aligned with the established Ahl Hadith movement, which is predominantly South Asian. Green Lane Mosque in Birmingham is among the most prominent focal points for these types of Salafis in the UK. So again, we see that local engagement in Birmingham, where there's a large Muslim community, is more amongst the traditional South Asian populace. You have converts among them, but the predominance is the culturally based Muslims, traditionally based Muslims. The third category I want to refer to now is actually the most divisive, destructive and unpopular element amongst Salafis in the UK and the West today. And that's none other than the cult-oriented Salafis, otherwise known as Salafi publications, or as I term them, the Abu Khadijite cult and their affiliates. Despite their dwindling numbers, their social media savvy projects provide and project a larger image than the cult's actual reality. And I don't want to go into too much detail about this cult and this entity and this classification in this episode. I would refer the listener and viewer to my Cultish Tendencies series, which has 14 episodes at the moment that speaks specifically about the cult. But suffice it to refer to an academic, Sadiq Hamid, in a book that he has written, Sufis, Salafis and Islamists, The Contested Ground of British Islamic Activism. He states as follows, quote, "However, this form of Salafism has not gone unchallenged by other Salafis. Abdul Haq Baker from Brixton Mosque feels that the Salafi Institute, as they're otherwise called, is too aggressive and has contributed to giving British Salafis a bad name," end of quote. And as I mentioned briefly, as with other cults, this particular one advocates keeping its followers and members at the very rudimentary and idealistic stages of cognition, where there is a dependency upon the leadership for religious instruction and a number of other socio-religious factors. Unfortunately, this rudimentary development of the members includes educated graduates from the University of Medina and other Western universities due to their respective social needs of belonging. And dependency on charismatic leadership is among the driving factors of this particular cult. The fourth and final category that I'd like to highlight, and this emerged over the past 3 decades, and that is mainstream Salafis with a small s. Many of these Salafis consider themselves Salafi or Athari, and a recent survey confirmed online that 73% of the respondents considered themselves simply Muslim, with the next largest percentage being those who considered themselves Salafi or Athari, and that amounted to 20% of that cohort. The next largest delineations were around only 2 and 3% respectively. So that 20% of members who participated in this survey shows the prominence of Salafiyya, Salafism, amongst the mainstream now. My own PhD research in 2009 highlighted that 53.3% of my interviewees considered themselves Salafi, while the remaining cohort were comfortable by describing themselves as Sunni Muslims. So this groundswell in the mainstream is a positive development for Salafiyya in the UK and hopefully in other Western countries, because it includes second and third generation Muslims who've grown up accessing authentically researched and referenced literature, which Salafi influence and involvement was an integral part of from the 90s upwards. And the influence of Salafiyya or Salafism in this area was not under doubt and continues not to be under any doubt. And it in fact caused or provoked a type of muscular Sufism, with the Sufi traditionalist movement developing and trying to counter this authentic referencing of Salafi literature and Salafi callers to the movement. And again, sticking with Sadiq Hamid, he observed in the same book, quoting, Salafism's main competitor in matters of scholarly authority is the TI network, that's the traditional Islam network, which steadily gained popularity since the mid-90s, end of quote. And before moving on to the next stage of this podcast, I want to remain with some other data that was obtained from the same source of online surveys, because it highlights a particular mood among the Muslim populace in the UK and the 82 respondents who answered the question to this survey. So the question was, which groups caused Muslims to doubt their faith? And the Takfiris, quoting ISIS as an example, saw 30% of the respondents highlight them as being those who cause such doubt or problems. An equal percentage of 30% also highlighted what they termed the tabdees, and in brackets they called them the madkhalis, which is a derogatory name for the SP cult followers. I say derogatory because they're referring to Sheikh Rabi bin Hadi al-Madkhali in Saudi Arabia. But I would say to replace the name of Madkhalis with the Abu Khadijites, because he is the sole source and originator of this division that emanated following the split and the fracture of Jamas in the late 90s when he emerged. So we see that they consider the Takfiris at 30% to cause them to doubt their faith. The Tabdis, being the Salafi publications, Abu Khadijite cult, at an equal number, 30%. And that's quite alarming, because the Abu Khadijites are actually Salafi with a very warped interpretation and behaviorally extreme tendencies. Salafis generally followed with 17%, saying that they caused them to doubt their faith, being the lowest number in this categorization. And Sufis were actually at 22%. So 22% of the surveyed group held that Sufis caused them to doubt their faith. So Salafis were at the lowest with 17% in that instance. Moving on to the second query regarding and relating to my cognitive framework, where the Salafi movement is positioned. And this was a difficult one for me to assess because it's subjective, of course. And I've already provided 4 classifications of where particular Salafi groups and entities are positioned. But I would say, placing those 4 entities on the framework, they would all be at different positions, relatively speaking. The easiest one to discern, again, are the cult, because it fits with other patterns of cults from different movements where the adherents are kept in a state of ignorance and personality worship, as it has been done with Abu Khadija, the head of the Abu Khadijites. We only need to juxtapose that with Nation of Islam, and we see how Elijah Muhammad was revered by the followers in that particular instance. We only need to look at the Jim Jones cult, where they did the Jonestown massacre in Guyana, to see the personality reverence and ignorance of the individuals, even though they had educated, intelligent members among them. So that's going to be the subject of another recording later on down the line, where I look at those elements in more detail. But suffice it to come back to this episode, looking at the Chronicles. So, on the whole, those who still subscribe to the movement of Salafism, where deferment and influence in socio-cultural and socio-political spheres are still devolved abroad to scholars who are unfamiliar or unaware of these contexts, are still at the secondary idealistic and abstract youthful phase. And that may refer to the Brixton community in some instances. And I'll repeat what I'm saying there. So those who still subscribe to the movement, the Salafi movement, which is demarcated by continual and often deferment and referencing to scholars for socio-cultural and socio-political aspects. I'm not talking about socio-religious in this instance, because we have to continually refer to the scholars regarding socio-religious aspects when it's to do with fiqh issues or issues of monotheism, tawheed, and particular contextualizations within a Western environment. But these entities that continue to go to the scholars for almost everything, where there should be a rudimentary understanding and application by now, shows that they have not progressed beyond the first 2 stages of my cognitive development framework. Again, I'll be explicit in stating that I'm not saying we shouldn't refer to scholars for socio-religious matters and other issues. But the previous paralysis, while deferring very straightforward matters to the scholars, is something that has harmed communities, families, and individuals. Because what has followed from those deferments when awaiting the scholars has been misconstrued edicts, misrepresented edicts, selectively applied edicts from those scholars used to browbeat other entities, to provide an environmental context where studying has been frowned upon, employment has been frowned upon, and the end result in some cases, especially amongst the urban communities, has been that ghettoization of communities and the children who have grown in those communities. Then we have, when applying, sticking with this framework, those who no longer feel the need to affiliate with organisations and specific groups subscribing to a codified Salafism. They're more likely to be at the latter two stages of the adult and mature phases, being self-assured about their adherence to the religion and their ability to access scholars directly or their students. Dependency, therefore, on the groups and movements like there was in the 90s and early noughties are therefore unnecessary. So again, we're speaking about what I believe is that fourth classification, the mainstream body of Salafis with a small s, who are quite independent, who are quite autonomous, who are quite self-assured, and are no longer involved in the internecine disputes among the Salafi groups that have plagued Salafiyya, Salafism across the Western world and in the Arab world for the past 3 decades. Moving on now, I will refer to some of the articles written in 2019, and I wrote a total of 16, this year being the most prolific period of writing articles due to the number of issues that had occurred during the year. So suffice it for me to refer to only a few of them. Reference can be made to my website to see the remaining articles that I will not highlight in this episode. The first of the articles I will highlight was on the 22nd of February, and where I wrote an article entitled "Left Out to Die, the Tragedy of Baby Jarrah Begum." And that was the last child of Shamima Begum. She had 3 children. This was one that died due to ill health in infancy. And this was in part contributed or exacerbated by the UK's refusal to return her to the UK for interrogation and possible trial. She was subsequently illegally stripped, in my opinion, of her UK citizenship and to date remains in a Syrian camp. The next article I wrote was in line with the terrible attacks in New Zealand, where a white supremacist went and killed a number of individuals at Friday prayer. So my article on the 21st of March was entitled "Restless Nights," nights being spelled Knights, and "Crescent Moons, Terror in Christchurch, New Zealand." On the 23rd of April, my article focused on the Sri Lanka attacks, no end in sight. And this addressed the 21st of April Easter attacks that saw 267 people killed in a series of attacks across Sri Lanka. 45 foreign nationals were among the dead on that occasion. And I had recently attended a conference at the end of January and resided in one of the hotels that was subsequently bombed, called the Kingsbury. So that rammed home to me, I think, the reality of terrorism, in that I would have interacted and engaged with some of the staff who would have lost their lives in that particular hotel. The 9th of December saw me write an article entitled "Usman Khan, Rehabilitation and Formers, Government Poster Boys and Prodigal Son Narratives." And this discussed the failed strategies and policies of the government and its inability to effectively distinguish between de-radicalisation and disengagement following the attacks of Usman, who was attending a conference close to London Bridge in which he fatally stabbed some individuals and was eventually shot dead by armed police. I will refer to conferences and workshops during that year, and as I just mentioned, I had attended a conference in Colombo, Sri Lanka on the 26th to the 28th of February. That was another United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime conference, and this was focusing on preventing violent extremism through rehabilitation and reintegration of violent extremist and terrorist offenders, and strengthening partnerships with civil society organisations and the local community. The second event of that year was on the 26th of March in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, where I was invited by the Presidency of State Security, the General Department for Counter-Extremism, to attend an event entitled Integration in Countering Terrorist Organizations Narratives, the Daesh organization as a model, the Daesh terrorist group as a model. I then travelled to the Maldives on the 3rd of August to deliver a lecture for the Islamic University of the Maldives and alongside the National Counterterrorism Centre. And this was an event entitled Taboo, workshops and seminars where I was to discuss and have dialogue with youth around very, very sensitive matters. That was a very beneficial event in which I met the Defence Minister and we discussed a number of issues. It was interesting to note that 2 of her children were studying in LSE in London, UK, and that she herself was a lawyer who had graduated from UK university. And the final conference workshop I attended was again in Sri Lanka. We were invited back to another United Nations conference and workshop, and this was entitled Promoting Regional Measures and Cooperation in Preventing Youth Involvement in Violent Extremism and Terrorism through Effective Criminal Justice Approaches and Legal Frameworks in South and Southeast Asia. Again, that was the 15th to the 17th of October. And in that particular event, or at that particular event, we addressed the Easter attacks and the complacency that the services, intelligence, police, government had regarding any threat of religiously inspired, or let's say so-called Muslim inspired terrorist attacks. Because at the February conference, they mainly lauded their success with the Tamils and the resistance, how they'd crushed that, and that they'd actually brought former rebels in to speak to that experience, which I found a bit disconcerting because it seemed somewhat staged. So they felt that the praise that they'd received and the accolade they'd received as being the most effective, or among the most effective in quelling extremism, gave them a false sense of security in which they believed that their society had now been cured of one of the longest standing disputes, and therefore terrorism on the whole. And this reflective stage of the second conference at the end, towards the end of the year, was very, very pertinent and unsurprising to see that this event was a very somber one, as they were still recovering and reeling from the shock of such a devastating series of terrorist attacks. As we draw to a conclusion of this episode now, I think it's prudent to cite some other academic research and observations regarding the effectiveness and influence of Salafism on the UK landscape. And referring to Dr. Annabel Inge again, she observes as follows, quote, Salafi preachers in the United Kingdom have actually been amongst the most vocal and prolific opponents of ISIS and jihadism in the British Muslim community, devoting sermons and articles refuting the militant group and warning Muslims not to associate with it. She further noticed, some British Salafi preachers and community figures are already encouraging Salafis to take a more flexible, rational approach than before. They argue that there has always been room for some pragmatism within Salafi doctrine, but overzealous and excessively literalist followers have often failed to recognise this fact. End of quote. And she was speaking to the more mainstream and mature development of Salafis. Again, as I'd mentioned earlier, moving away from this requirement of belonging to a group or an entity that shaped, dictated and codified aspects of Salafiyya beyond what they had previously been confined to or amongst. And she also mentioned here, quote, to justify their flexible stance, these leaders point, for example, to the principle that one should not seek to remove an evil, for example, isolating oneself from non-Muslims to avoid too much intermingling, if it leads to a greater evil, such as state interference, antagonism towards Salafis, and disharmony within families and society. According to Abdul Haq Baker, UK Salafis' excessive literalism and blind following of the scholars has meant that over the years, Salafi women and men have pulled out of society, withdrawn themselves from society because, quote, we don't want to be mixing, close quote. So they ghettoised themselves and they've ghettoised their children in the process. Continuing with her quote. These critical comments may seem surprising coming from the former chairman of one of Britain's most important Salafi mosques. But since the late 90s, he has gradually reconsidered how Salafis should contextualise the teachings, particularly in Western environments. He told me, Dr. Annabel Inge, in November 2015, that UK Salafis, having more knowledge of their personal circumstances than the scholars do, should judge for themselves how far to apply strict Salafi teachings in Britain. If unsure, they should consult the scholars, but they should challenge the rulings of the scholars if they fail to recognise the realities of the Western context. Continuing with her quote. Abdul Haq says that dozens and dozens of British Salafis are coming round to his more flexible way of thinking. But his approach is still considered rather radical by many Salafis because it elevates the role of the lay intellect, which is seen as a key instrument for the corruption of pure Islam. It is difficult to assess how influential these more moderate voices will become within the Salafi community. But any wider tempering of rigid attitudes would probably happen organically, rather than as a result of external pressure or interference, which could simply displace or even harden them. And we see that the die-hard cult elements are the ones that want to keep the Salafi adherents and wider Muslims who have gravitated towards this authentic pursuit of knowledge and, by extension, Salafism, in a place of abstract learning, of ignorance, and the divorcing of using critical thinking skills. And you'll see that the claim of following the Quran and Sunnah and the scholars has become a slogan for them. But in actuality, those who are amongst the mainstream Salafis now are the ones who are more adhering to these principles of Quran, Sunnah, asking the scholars if they don't know, instead of this dogmatic, sloganistic claim and this blind following, this reprehensive blind following of particular scholars. Drawing to a close now, about Salafiyya and Salafis. I think one of the most effective and emphatic descriptions of Salafiyya come from none other than Sheikh Ali Hassan Abdul Hamid. And it describes that fourth category that I've highlighted, the mainstream Muslim populace of Salafis. And he says as follows: upon mention of the terms Salafiyya and the Salafis, many people think about the existence of a group or party or the development of biased partisanship or the likes. Yet none of that is the real case in regards to the upright Salafi methodology and the ideas of its preachers. For Salafiyya really means the correct comprehensive Islam which Allah revealed upon the heart of Muhammad, may Allah's peace and blessings be upon him. Salafiyya is not at all a restricted term for a group of people. Rather, it is an ascription to the Salaf, the praiseworthy and righteous predecessors, mentioned in the Quran and the Sunnah. So, all who understand the religion according to the understanding of the righteous Salaf of the Ummah is Salafi, whether he mentions this frankly and openly or is quiet about it. So Salafiyya is not a party, group or organised movement. Rather, it is for all Muslims, groups and individuals, because it is comprehensive Islam according to the book and the Sunnah with the understanding of the Salaf Saleh. So it is incumbent on the Ummah to compare its situation ideologically, practically, perceptively and executively with the manhaj of the Salaf and their application of the Deen. End of quote. I do not think anyone could disagree with the comprehensiveness of this statement from Sheikh Ali Hassan. And I think it is a good quote to end this entire 30 episode podcast series. But before doing so, I will refer to one final event that continues to affect us 7 months on in 2020. On the 1st of December 2019, the earliest traceable patient, a 55-year-old man, developed symptoms of what would be classified as COVID-19 in Wuhan, China. And months on, the world has been overrun by this pandemic. To date, almost 13 million people are infected, and it has affected every part and every society and community. And many of us know of individuals who have succumbed to the illness and, even worse, died. And I think this is a sober place to conclude these chronicles. And I hope that other chronicles can emerge with the same veracity, if not more, highlighting and charting other movements in the UK that have shaped the Muslim community's development and impact, as well as involvement in UK society over the past 30 years or so. I'll end by saying that we hope and pray that this trial of COVID-19, this pandemic, is lifted. It can be tackled, that a vaccine that we trust can be developed, or that we develop a resistance from natural products, and that's still a reality, and that we can remember those we've lost and those fighting to recover. I want to thank those listeners who have continually engaged with me throughout this journey, and I appreciate and acknowledge their input, and in some areas constructive criticism. And for those who have benefited, again, thank you for your contributions and favourable messages that I've received ever since I started and embarked upon these chronicles. This is the end of Chronicles of UK Salafism, an insider perspective. Thank you for listening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to those Muslims who have paid attention, and goodbye to non-Muslim listeners.